Pick any girl you want, they mocked. The cowboy pointed and said, her. The one you call too ugly. The sun leaned low over Whisper Creek, spilling a gold, so tired it looked like honey poured too slow. Dust curled above the main road, where wagons rolled and laughter rang sharp like tin spoons against cracked glass. It was Founders Week, a time when the small frontier town pretended it was bigger, better, more alive than it truly was. Men wore their best boots, women pressed their skirts, and every corner carried a scent of whiskey, horses, and something close to loneliness. By the saloon porch, a pack of ranch hands gathered, young, sunburned, hungry for a kind of attention only mockery could feed. Their leader, Wade Tiller, had that grin that could cut a man if you stared too long at it. He leaned against the rail, tossing coins between his fingers. "Pick any girl you want, cowboy," he called to the stranger tying his horse nearby. "Go on. This town's full of sweet ones. Let's see your taste." The stranger looked up. Caleb Walker, 33, broad-shouldered, quiet-eyed, the kind of man who didn't speak unless there was something worth saying. His shirt was road-worn, dust clinging to the hem. He moved like someone used to silence. He'd come for supplies, maybe a night's rest, but the crowd had made him their amusement. One of the men shoved a girl forward, then another. Each was paraded as if kindness were a prize to win. Laughter rose in waves. Some women flushed with shyness. Others rolled their eyes and stepped aside. But then came a silence, so thick you could hear the flag ropes clatter on the pole above the saloon. Eliza Hart stood apart. She wasn't laughing. She'd come to sell small hand-sewn trimmings, bonnets, patches, mended gloves. But her basket now hung heavy against her hip, as if shame itself weighed it down. 29, with hair like dried wheat and a body the town never forgave her for. She was not built for the tiny corsets or teasing smiles the other girls wore like perfume. Her hands were work-rough, her eyes too serious, her frame full in ways they called wrong. Wade saw her standing there, trying to melt into shadow. "Or maybe you fancy the big one," he shouted. "Eliza the mule. Strong enough to carry you, eh?" Laughter cracked open again, cruel and loud. Eliza didn't move. Her throat tightened, but she didn't cry. She'd heard it all before, ugly, too big, not proper wife material. Each word had settled somewhere deep, like small stones she learned to live with. She looked at the ground and tried to breathe through it. Caleb turned, his shadow long across the dirt. His gaze traveled the line of women, past the painted faces and fluttering fans, stopping where Eliza stood. Her eyes met his only for a heartbeat, long enough for him to see the fight inside her, that flicker of endurance hidden behind all that shame. He raised his chin slightly. "Her," he said. The laughter died like a fire doused in rain. "What did you say?" Wade spat, disbelief twisting his mouth. Caleb nodded once, slow and sure. "Her. The one you call too big and ugly." No one spoke. The silence felt heavier than the heat. Even the horses shifted uneasily. Eliza's breath caught. Surely this was another cruel game, some joke meant to wound her deeper. But Caleb didn't smile, didn't sneer. His expression was calm, unshaken. He stepped off the porch, dust puffing under his boots, and came to stand before her. She couldn't bring herself to lift her head, but she felt his presence, steady, unhurried. Then, softly, he held out his hand, not as a challenge, not as pity, simply a hand offered, clean and quiet. The others whispered, waiting for her to flinch, to run. Instead, after a long, trembling moment, she placed her hand in his. The crowd broke into murmurs, confusion, mockery, maybe even fear of something they didn't understand. Caleb said nothing more. He led her gently away, down the road lined with cottonwoods, toward the edge of town. His stride was slow enough that she didn't have to hurry. When they reached her gate, a small cottage, half hidden behind overgrown sage, she found her voice. "Why did you do that?" He didn't look at her right away. He adjusted his hat, eyes tracing the far hills where the light was folding itself away. "You looked like you needed someone to stand beside you," he said finally. No pity in it. No flirtation either. Just truth spoken like an old hymn. She wanted to answer, but words failed. She nodded instead, fingers clutching the handle of her basket. He gave her one last look, gentle, unreadable, and turned back toward his horse. When the hooves faded, Eliza sank onto her porch steps, the wooden boards warm from the day's heat. The world around her felt changed somehow, as though someone had opened a window in a long-closed room. She didn't know the man's story or why he had defended her, but she knew one thing. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her without judgment. Inside, she lit a lamp. The flame trembled, softening the edges of her small home, her mended curtains, her half-finished sewing, the chipped teacup she used each morning. She stared at her reflection in the window, tired eyes, flushed cheeks, a woman who'd learned to make herself small to avoid being broken. Yet tonight she felt something move inside her chest, a kind of restless, fragile hope. Outside, the night deepened. Caleb rode along the creek trail, where the moonlight split over the water like shards of glass. He couldn't say what made him step forward back there. Maybe it was the memory of being laughed at once himself a lifetime ago. Maybe it was the way she stood, silent but unbowed. Whatever it was, he knew he'd remember her face long after this night. The next morning, Whisper Creek woke to gossip as it always did. The saloon girls told the story first, how the quiet cowboy had picked Eliza Hart in front of everyone. Some said he'd done it to shame the others. Some claimed it was a dare. Others swore they saw tenderness in the way he looked at her. By noon, the story had spread from the blacksmith shop to the church steps, bending and twisting like smoke. Eliza tried to ignore it. She went about her work, sewing near the window, pretending the whispers outside didn't reach her. But she could feel the weight of every passing glance, the curiosity mixed with cruelty. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the barns, she heard a knock. When she opened the door, Caleb stood there again, holding a small paper sack. "You left this behind," he said, offering it. Inside were the sewing threads she'd dropped yesterday. "Oh," she managed, startled. "Thank you." He hesitated, then nodded toward the small field beyond her porch. "You keep a good garden," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "It tries to live." He looked at her then, and something eased in his expression. "That's all any of us can do." The silence between them wasn't awkward. It felt safe. He tipped his hat and turned to leave, but she spoke again, surprising herself. "Mr. Walker?" He paused. "People might talk," she said quietly. He turned back, his voice steady. "Let them." For a moment, they just stood there, framed by the fading light, the seamstress with her guarded heart and the cowboy who didn't fear her shadow. Then he walked off into the twilight, his figure swallowed by the silver mist rising from the creek. Inside her chest, something bloomed that had long been buried, a wish she'd stopped daring to name. Not love, not yet. Just the feeling that maybe she wasn't invisible after all. And though she didn't know it, Caleb felt the same ache in the hollow of his chest as he rode back to his lonely cabin that night. A sense that some part of his long, quiet life had just shifted. He couldn't name it either, but he didn't need to. Sometimes, the beginning of a story doesn't arrive with thunder or fire. Sometimes it comes quietly, in a hand extended under the fading sun, in a voice that simply says, "You looked like you needed someone to stand beside you." And in the stillness of that moment, something sacred begins to take root. The weeks drifted by like slow water under the cottonwoods. Whisper Creek forgot its fairground laughter, but Eliza could still feel it echo inside her some nights, that cruel chorus dissolving only when she thought of the quiet cowboy who had silenced it with one soft sentence. Caleb Walker had gone back to his cabin north of town, near the ridge where pines grew thick, yet his presence seemed to linger in every still hour. One morning, when frost still silvered the edges of her window, she found him again, his horse tethered by the fence, his shape outlined against the dawn. He had come wordlessly, carrying a small sack of oats and a shy smile. "The soil's hungry," he said, glancing toward her wilted garden. "I thought I might help feed it." She wanted to tell him she didn't need help, that she managed fine, but the words fell apart when she saw the quiet sincerity in his face. He stayed that morning, turning earth beside her with a steady rhythm, neither of them speaking more than they had to. The days began to follow a new pattern. Caleb would come by after his ranch work, fixing the fence or hauling water, never asking for thanks. Sometimes he'd bring small gifts, a handful of wild berries, a piece of strong twine, a book of worn psalms he said belonged to his mother. He never spoke about himself unless she asked, and even then his answers were brief, thoughtful. She learned that he had once been married long ago, but the name of the woman never crossed his lips. Loss, she guessed, lived quietly in him. As spring warmed the land, Eliza began to walk the ridge path every morning, her steps slow at first. She'd been told her body was too heavy, her figure too much, but she started to wonder if maybe strength was not something to be ashamed of. Sometimes Caleb joined her, keeping his distance, letting silence fill the space between them like music. When she faltered on the climb, he did not rush to steady her. He waited, trusted she would find her breath again. That patience was a new kind of kindness, gentler than any she had known. The walking changed her, not just her body, though she noticed one morning that her reflection in the basin looked somehow lighter, her eyes brighter, her shoulders freer. It was the way she began to carry herself, less folded, more open. The townsfolk started noticing too. At the general store, the merchant's wife whispered that Miss Hart looked different, softer. The blacksmith nodded when she passed, not with mockery, but with a touch of respect. Yet the old whispers were never far behind. People in small towns love change only when it isn't happening to someone they once called small. One evening, while she mended a torn coat for Caleb by lamplight, he watched her hands move through the fabric. "You mend things as if you're stitching the world back together," he said softly. She looked up, startled, and for the first time saw something in his eyes that frightened her, a depth she didn't know how to meet. She turned away, laughing nervously. "It's only a coat," she murmured. He smiled, but the silence afterward felt charged, alive. Summer came hard that year, all sun and dust. The river shrank, and the ground cracked like old parchment. Caleb spent long days repairing fences and driving cattle. Eliza kept to her sewing and her morning walks. One afternoon, he found her sitting by the stream, sleeves rolled, hair undone, her face flushed from the heat. She had been walking farther each day. He sat beside her without a word, the quiet of the place settling around them. "I used to hate this river," she said finally. "When I was a girl, boys from town would shout names from the bridge. I thought if I came here, the water would tell them the truth about me. But it never did." Caleb leaned back on his hands, watching the water slip between stones. "Maybe the river was waiting for you to stop listening to them." She turned to him, half smiling, half crying. "You think it's that simple?" "Nothing simple," he said. "But sometimes it's true." The sun slid lower, turning the river gold. He reached for her hand, not out of impulse, but as if guided by something quiet and inevitable. She didn't pull away. His fingers were rough, hers scarred from needles and years of work. They fit. For a moment the world felt suspended, tender and still. Then, as though afraid of what might follow, she stood abruptly. "I should get home before dark." He rose too, letting her go without a word. After that evening, she found it harder to keep him out of her thoughts. When she woke, she looked for the trail of hoof prints outside her gate. When she sewed, she caught herself smiling for no reason. It frightened her, this softness. She had lived too long behind walls to trust warmth that came from someone else's eyes. But Caleb was patient. He never pressed, never demanded. He simply kept showing up. When she lifted a heavy crate, his hands were there. When her garden wilted, he found water. And one night, when a thunderstorm broke open the sky, he came running to help secure her shutters. They stood together in the doorway afterward, drenched and laughing. Lightning flickered behind them, and the world smelled of rain and new earth. "You don't have to keep saving me," she said. He looked at her with quiet seriousness. "Maybe I'm not the one doing the saving." She wanted to speak, but her throat closed around the words. Something inside her trembled. Not fear this time, but recognition. By late August, her transformation had become impossible to ignore. The townsfolk who once mocked her now stopped mid-step when she passed. Her figure had changed, yes, but it wasn't beauty that startled them. It was the light in her face, the unbroken confidence. Even Wade Tiller, the man who'd humiliated her, found himself tongue-tied when she entered the store one afternoon. Caleb happened to be there, loading sacks of grain. Their eyes met across the room, a silent understanding passing between them. He saw the way she stood now, upright, self-assured, and pride swelled quietly in his chest. Outside, Wade followed her. "You sure turned yourself around, Eliza," he said with a crooked grin. "Guess miracles happen." She stopped, meeting his gaze without flinching. "No miracle," she said. "Just work and a little kindness." Wade laughed, embarrassed, but the sound died when Caleb appeared behind her, calm as the horizon. "She owes you nothing," Caleb said evenly. "You had your chance to be decent." Wade muttered something about jokes and walked off, his swagger thinner than before. Eliza turned to Caleb, still trembling slightly from the rush of it. "You didn't have to step in," she said. "I know." He looked at her, his voice soft. "But I wanted to." That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, moonlight spilling across her hands, and thought of all the ways a heart learns to open, first with caution, then with wonder, then with the quiet courage of trust. She had thought love belonged to the beautiful, to those untouched by ridicule. But now she understood something deeper. Love belonged to anyone who had the patience to see it through pain. When morning came, she walked farther than she ever had, up to the ridge above Whisper Creek. From there she could see the entire town, small and pale under the dawn. The same people who once laughed were now tiny figures she could barely distinguish. The world seemed different from that height, not cruel, just distant. Behind her came the sound of hooves. Caleb rode up, stopping beside her, the wind tugging at his coat. They stood together without speaking, watching the light spill over the valley. "You made it to the top," he said finally. "I had help," she replied, her voice soft but sure. He smiled. "You did the climbing." They stood that way for a long time, side by side, the silence full of unspoken promise. Below them, the town stirred to life. Above them, hawks circled lazily in the clean morning air. When she turned to him at last, her face glowed with something steady and new. He reached up, brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek, and said almost reverently, "You're not big at all, Eliza. You're beautiful." She closed her eyes, a tear slipping free. For once, she didn't doubt the words. She didn't shrink from them either. She let them settle in her like truth returning home. And though neither said it aloud, both knew something had shifted forever, that whatever had begun in mockery had turned into something the world couldn't touch. As they rode back down the ridge, the light followed them. The wind smelled of sage and promise. For the first time in years, Eliza felt entirely alive, no longer hiding from herself, no longer waiting for permission to be seen. What waited beyond this day, she didn't know. But as Caleb glanced toward her and smiled that quiet smile of his, she understood that sometimes the truest redemption isn't in being chosen. It's in finally believing you were worth choosing all along. Stay close, friend. Subscribe so you don't miss the next tale beneath the wide western sky.